Clara's voice crackled over the comms, calm and steady amidst the chaos. "Lieutenant, you're in a kill box. 50 meters to your 9 o'clock is a concrete drainage culvert. It's not on the schematics, but it's there. It's your only way out." The SEALs, pinned down and taking heavy fire, looked at the hand, drawn map clutched in their hands, then back at the hellstorm erupting around them. How could the quiet girl who fixed their gear know this place better than they did? What secrets were hidden in her past that allowed her to see the battlefield with more clarity than their own multi-million-dollar satellites? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The briefing room at the forward operating base was a sterile, windowless box, perpetually humming with the drone of overworked electronics and smelling of stale coffee. It was a scent layered with the faint, metallic tang of cleaned weaponry and the sharp ozone from the servers lining the wall. Fluorescent lights cast a flat, unforgiving glare over everything, especially the room's centerpiece, a large, high-definition digital map table. Currently, it displayed a satellite overlay of a dense urban sprawl, a labyrinth of concrete and dust where their target was hiding. In a corner, away from the main table, Clara Vance sat on a stool, a ghost in practical maintenance fatigues. She was meticulously organizing a case of sensitive optical equipment, her movements precise, economical, and utterly absorbing. Her focus was so complete that she seemed less a person and more a part of the room's background machinery, as inanimate as the humming servers. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, on the other hand, consumed the space. He paced at the head of the table, a man who wore his supreme confidence like a second skin. His voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the low banter of his team as he used a laser pointer to gesture at the glowing map. "Intel says the asset is here," he declared, the red dot dancing over a third-floor apartment. "Entry is via the rooftop. Standard approach, minimal fuss. The tech is flawless, gentlemen, but it's our boots that get the job done." His words were for his men, but his tone held a note of derision for the very technology he was relying on, a subtle mockery of the idea that anything but sheer force of will could determine a mission's outcome. His team, 6 operators from SEAL Team 3, were relaxed but attentive. They were a brotherhood forged in fire, their casual posture belying the coiled lethality within each man. Among them was Hawk, a seasoned operator whose observant eyes missed nothing, and Rook, younger, with an eagerness that hadn't yet been hardened into cynicism. They occasionally glanced toward Clara, but their looks were dismissive, the kind one gives a janitor or a piece of furniture. She was the tech, the grease monkey who fixed their expensive toys. She wasn't part of their world. Rook, leaning forward, pointed a finger at the screen. "Sir, what about this alleyway here? Could be a blind spot from the drone's angle." Thorne waved it away with a flick of his laser pointer, his arrogance unassailable. "We'll be in and out before they know we're there, Rook. Don't overthink it. Let the gear do its job." The message was clear. Trust the plan, trust the commander, and don't question the multi-million-dollar system laid out before them. One of the other SEALs, a man with a perpetual smirk, leaned back in his chair and called across the room, "Hey, Clara, you got a manual for how to make this coffee taste less like battery acid?" Laughter rippled around the table. Clara didn't look up from the delicate fiber, optic cable she was cleaning. "No, sir," she replied, her voice quiet, almost flat. "That's outside my operational parameters." Her response was so devoid of inflection it barely registered. It was heard but not listened to, the words of a speaking clock, and the men immediately forgot she had spoken. The palpable sense of hierarchy in the room was a physical force. The SEALs were the warriors, the tip of the spear. Clara was an outsider, a civilian contractor who serviced their tools, and the chasm between them was absolute. She continued her work, her quiet, focused energy a stark contrast to the loud, boisterous confidence that filled the rest of the room. She preferred it this way. Invisibility was a form of armor. The mission was everything, the plan was perfect, and the men were ready. Then the technology failed. It started with a flicker. The high-resolution satellite image on the table wavered, like a reflection on disturbed water. Then it dissolved into a cascade of shimmering green and purple pixels, a digital waterfall of corrupted data. A moment later, the screen went black, displaying only a single cryptic error code in stark white letters: ERR, sync, fail, 0xDEAD beef. A collective groan filled the room. The sudden silence that followed was heavier than the previous noise. A tech specialist was summoned, a harried man who typed furiously on a connected laptop, his face growing paler by the second. He finally looked up, shaking his head. The primary server was down, he explained, and the backup data was hopelessly corrupted. The map, the cornerstone of their entire operation, was gone. Thorne slammed his open palm on the dead screen, the sound cracking through the tense quiet. His carefully constructed plan, his flawless mission, had just evaporated. "You have got to be kidding me," he seethed, his voice low and dangerous. "A multi-million-dollar system, and it's a paperweight." He turned to his team, his face a mask of fury. His anger was a shield, hiding the sudden, terrifying feeling of helplessness. "Well, that's it. Mission is scrubbed. Can't go in blind. Guess we're done here." The energy in the room deflated instantly. The coiled readiness of the SEALs unspooled into bitter frustration. They began to gather their gear, the mission aborted before it had even begun. The air was thick with disappointment and muttered curses. As the men were turning to leave, their shoulders slumped in defeat. A quiet voice cut through the grumbling. "Excuse me, sir." Thorne spun around, his annoyance flaring. "What is it, Vance? Did you find the right manual for the map?" The question was a sneer, a final, frustrated jab at the woman in the corner. Clara stood up, placing her tools carefully back in their case. She met his gaze without flinching. "No, sir," she said, her voice steady, "but I can draw it for you." A moment of stunned silence descended upon the room. It was so profound that the hum of the electronics seemed to roar into the vacuum. Then came a few disbelieving snickers. Rook coughed to cover a laugh. Thorne stared at her, as if she had just sprouted a second head, his expression a mixture of contempt and disbelief. "Draw it?" he repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. "Are you serious? This isn't a school art project, Vance. This is a Tier 1 operation." Clara didn't react to his tone. She simply walked to the now useless map table, her footsteps unnervingly silent on the concrete floor. She picked up a discarded whiteboard marker from the table's edge, her movements calm and deliberate. She cleared her throat, a small, almost apologetic sound. "You're inserting 2 clicks out from the northeast," she began, her voice a low, steady monotone. "The primary approach vector is along the Al-Rashid Aqueduct." And then she began to draw. Her hand moved with an unnerving speed and precision that was utterly mesmerizing. It was not a crude sketch. It was a detailed topographical map, flowing from the tip of the marker as if being downloaded directly from a satellite. The room went completely silent again, the only sound the soft, rhythmic scratching of her pen on the smooth, black surface. The SEALs, who had been packing their gear, stopped. They turned, one by one, and watched, their expressions shifting from amusement to disbelief, and then, slowly, to a profound and unsettling awe. "The elevation here is 300 meters, she narrated, her voice never wavering, her eyes fixed on her creation. She drew contour lines with practiced ease. "It gives you a clear line of sight to the target building, but it also exposes you to the watchtower on the eastern ridge." She drew a small X on a rise. "You need to use this series of retaining walls for cover." A series of parallel lines appeared. "There are 3 fallback zones. The first is a dried-up well here." She drew a small circle. "The second is a collapsed market stall here." A small, shaded square. "And the third is a subterranean access tunnel for the old sewer system. The entrance is behind a rusted grate, here." Another X, this one partially obscured by a sketched wall. She drew small squares for buildings, X's for danger zones, dotted lines for patrol routes. She added details that had only been visible for fractions of a second as Thorne had cycled through different data overlays during the initial briefing weeks ago, details no normal person could possibly have noticed, let alone retained. Finally, she stopped. She placed the cap back on the marker with a soft click and slid the massive hand-drawn map across the table toward the dumbfounded lieutenant. "The digital map was wrong about the blind spot," she said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying an immense, undeniable weight. She pointed to the alley Rook had asked about. "The alley Rook mentioned is a funnel. They use it for ambushes. My route avoids it." Hawk, the veteran SEAL, leaned closer, his eyes wide as he stared at the drawing. He muttered to the man next to him, his voice thick with disbelief. "That's Tier 5 recon detail. That's not on any standard briefing. How the hell does she know that?" Clara lifted her gaze and met Thorne's stunned, uncomprehending stare. The invisible technician, the woman they looked through as if she were glass, was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone with eyes that held the vast, intricate landscape of a battlefield within them. "You'll make it home," she said, her voice a simple statement of fact, "if you stick to that line." The hand-drawn map sat in the center of the table, a stark, analog miracle in a high-tech world. The air in the briefing room was electric with a tension so thick it felt like a physical presence. The SEALs, who moments before had been defeated and ready to depart, were now gathered around the table, their heads bent as they studied the intricate details of Clara's drawing. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, uncomfortable respect. Thorn was the first to break the silence. His voice, when it came, was not a shout but a low, dangerous hiss, dripping with suspicion. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his eyes locking onto Clara's. "Who gave you this intel?" He was accusing her of espionage, of holding back classified information. It was the only explanation his mind could conjure that didn't involve shattering his entire understanding of the world. Clara met his hostile gaze without blinking. "I saw it," she said, her voice as calm and even as it had been when she was describing the operational parameters of a targeting laser. "When you were cycling through the satellite feeds and drone footage during the initial planning phase 2 weeks ago, I remembered it." Thorn let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, devoid of any humor. "Remembered it? You remembered meter topographical data and enemy patrol routes? Nobody has that kind of memory." His denial was fierce, a desperate attempt to hold on to a reality where maintenance techs didn't possess God-like powers of observation. It was Hawk who looked up from the map, his eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with deep, analytical thought. "The detail is right, Lieutenant," he said, his voice cutting through Thorn's disbelief. He tapped a point on the map. "The placement of that watchtower, it matches the recon photos from Operation Sandviper 3 years ago. It wasn't in the current intel package." Rook, his face pale with astonishment, nodded in agreement. He pointed to another part of the drawing. "And this sewer access? I saw a grate like that on a street view pass, but it was dismissed as irrelevant in the briefing notes." Thorn felt his authority, once absolute, cracking and splintering like ice under a hammer blow. His men were looking at the map, then at Clara, and he could see the shift in their eyes. He tried to reassert control, to pull them back from the edge of this absurdity. "It's a trick," he snapped, his voice rising. "A gamble. We are not risking a mission and the lives of my men on a doodle from a maintenance tech." The word doodle hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to diminish the masterpiece of tactical intelligence that lay before them. But the spell was broken. Clara was no longer invisible. She was the center of a storm of confusion, suspicion, and a terrifying burgeoning faith. Thorn's arrogance, stripped bare, had curdled into a defensive hostility that was plain for all to see. Hawk's pragmatism and Rook's youthful curiosity had already led them to consider the impossible, and the seed of that possibility was now planted in the minds of the entire team. Just as Thorn opened his mouth to scrub the mission for good, a new presence made itself known. Commander Blackwood entered the briefing room without a sound, his quiet arrival more commanding than any shouted order. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of countless campaigns, his eyes calm and deeply analytical. He took in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance: the furious lieutenant, the divided team, and the quiet woman standing beside the impossible map. "Lieutenant Thorn." Blackwood's voice was low, yet it carried an authority that made Thorn straighten up as if zapped with a cattle prod. "What is the meaning of this? I was told the mission was scrubbed." Thorn's face flushed. "It is, sir. The system failed. We have no viable intel." "Sir," Hawk interjected, his tone respectful but firm. "That might not be entirely true." He gestured to the hand-drawn map that lay like a sacred text on the table. Blackwood walked over, his gaze falling upon the drawing. He picked it up, his movements deliberate. For a long, silent minute, he studied it, his eyes tracing the lines, absorbing the details. The silence stretched, amplifying the tension in the room. Finally, he looked up, his sharp, analytical gaze moving from the map to Clara. "Miss Vance," he asked, his voice even, "is this your work?" "Yes, Commander," Clara replied, her own voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo in the charged atmosphere. "And your source?" "Memory, sir." Blackwood's expression didn't change. He looked at Thorn, whose face was a thunderous mask of indignation, then back at the map. He had seen enough. He made a decision. "Thorn," he commanded, "take your team. Run a simulation based on this route. Every contingency. I want a full risk assessment in 1 hour." He then turned to Hawk. "Hawk, Cross, reference every point on this map with our archival data, everything we have. Operation Sandviper, Street View passes, old SIGINT reports, everything." His eyes found Rook. "Rook, get me all available satellite imagery of these coordinates from the last 72 hours. I want to see if we can verify this funnel she mentioned." The orders were rapid, precise, and left no room for argument. The team, galvanized by purpose, moved to obey. Blackwood then turned his full attention back to Clara, who had stood silently through it all. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "you're with me." As she followed the commander out of the room, Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. It was a fragile, unfamiliar sensation that fluttered in her chest, a feeling that was not quite hope, but was adjacent to it. For the first time since she had been given a new name and a new life, someone in authority was not dismissing her, but was choosing to see. Commander Blackwood's office was as sparse and functional as the man himself. A single computer monitor sat on a clean desk, flanked by two simple chairs. There were no personal photos, no commendation plaques, just the bare essentials required to command a forward operating base. He gestured for Clara to sit, then took the chair opposite her, the hand, drawn map, placed carefully on the desk between them. He wasn't aggressive, but his questions were as precise and probing as a surgeon's scalpel. "Your file says you have a degree in library science and a certification in micro-electronics repair," Blackwood began, his eyes fixed on her. "It says you've been a contractor for 3 years, with exemplary, if unremarkable, service records. It says nothing about a photographic memory." Clara corrected him gently. "It's not photographic, sir. It's eidetic and structural. I remember layouts, patterns, schematics, how things fit together." She saw the world not as a series of pictures, but as a complex, interconnected blueprint. "And you've never mentioned this?" Blackwood asked, his gaze unwavering. "No one ever asked, sir," she replied simply. "It's not usually relevant to calibrating a targeting pod." The answer was honest, but it was also a shield. For years, her abilities had been a secret she guarded fiercely, a part of a past she had been ordered to bury. Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, becoming more intense. "This level of detail," he said, tapping the map. "It's more than just memory. It's analysis. You didn't just remember the terrain. You identified threats, fallback zones, and tactical advantages. You saw the ambush funnel that my lieutenant, with all his training and experience, missed. That requires training." For the first time, Clara's composure wavered. A flicker of a painful, deeply buried memory surfaced in her eyes, a shadow that passed as quickly as it came. Her hands, resting in her lap, clenched into tight fists. "I read a lot," she said, her voice a little too tight. "Military history, tactical manuals. It's a hobby." The explanation was plausible. It was also, Blackwood sensed with absolute certainty, incomplete. He was a man who had built his career on reading people, on sensing the truths they tried to conceal behind their words. And Clara Vance was concealing something vast. He saw the flicker, the momentary break in her carefully constructed dam of composure. He knew her hobby was a cover story, a thin blanket thrown over a much deeper, more complex truth. He decided, in that moment, to dig deeper into her background, to look for the anomalies, the digital ghosts that every life leaves behind. He had a feeling that whatever he found would be far from unremarkable. The interrogation was a tense cat and mouse game. Clara was guarded, a fortress of quiet deference, revealing only what was absolutely necessary. Blackwood was patient, willing to peel back the layers one by one. He, and the audience of his own intuition, were now convinced that the quiet technician was the key to a mystery far more profound than a failed mission map. The SEAL's ready room, a space that usually buzzed with the raw, boisterous energy of apex predators, was now thick with a different kind of atmosphere. The familiar scent of gun oil and sweat was still present, but it was undercut by a current of nervous, focused tension. The usual bravado had been replaced by a quiet, almost reverent diligence. Photocopied sheets of Clara's hand-drawn map were laid out on every available surface, and each member of the team was studying their copy with an intensity they normally reserved for enemy schematics. They were gearing up, their movements economical and precise, but their minds were elsewhere, grappling with the impossible reality of their new mission plan. Thorne, however, was a storm cloud in the center of the tense calm. He stood apart from his men, his jaw tight, running his own simulations on a ruggedized tablet. He was desperately searching for a flaw, a single error in Clara's plan that would justify his skepticism and restore his shattered sense of order. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't. He stalked over to Hawk, who was methodically cleaning the bolt of his rifle, his movements smooth and practiced. "This is insane," Thorne hissed, keeping his voice low so only Hawk could hear. "We're betting our lives, the entire mission, on a ghost story, a memory from the tech girl." Hawk didn't look up from his work. He slid the bolt back into the receiver with a satisfying metallic click. "The simulations are holding up, Lieutenant," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Her route is solid, more than solid. It's elegant, He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting Thorne's. "It uses the terrain in ways the computer algorithm never would have suggested. It's like it was planned by someone who's been there." Thorne was about to retort, to argue that elegance didn't save you from bullets, when the hatch to the ready room slid open. Rook entered, and the look on his face silenced the entire room. He was pale, his usual youthful eagerness replaced by a wide-eyed shock that seemed to have hollowed him out. He held his own tablet in a white-knuckled grip. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a croak. He walked directly to Thorne. "You need to see this." He held up the tablet. On the screen was a high-resolution satellite photo. Time, stamped just 3 hours prior. It showed the very alley that Rook had questioned in the briefing, the one Thorne had dismissed, and Clara had labeled a funnel. In the image, a civilian vehicle was stopped dead in the middle of the narrow passage. The doors were flung open, and several armed men, who had seemingly appeared from nowhere, were aggressively detaining the occupants, dragging them from the car. The men had emerged from the exact shadowed doorways Clara had implicitly warned them about. Rook swallowed hard, his eyes flicking from the screen to Thorne's face. "She was right," he whispered, the words hanging in the dead, silent air. "It's an ambush point. The official intel, the multi-million-dollar system. It missed it completely." The room fell into a profound silence. The soft scrape of a cleaning rod, the click of a magazine being seated, all of it ceased. Every eye was on Thorne. The reality of what Clara had given them, what she had saved them from, crashed down upon the team with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just following a map, they were following a lifeline thrown to them by an impossible source. Thorne stared at the image on the screen, his face ashen. The proof was undeniable, absolute. His certainty, the bedrock of his command and his pride, was not just eroding, it had been pulverized into dust. The map was no longer just a drawing, it was a prophecy, and they had just witnessed its first, terrifying fulfillment. Late into the night, long after the base had settled into a quiet rhythm of guard shifts and generator hums, Commander Blackwood sat in his office, bathed in the cold blue light of his monitor. He had sent the SEALs to get what rest they could before their pre-dawn departure, but for him, sleep was an impossibility. The mystery of Clara Vance had taken root in his mind, a complex problem that demanded a solution. He had initiated a deep background check, pulling on strings he hadn't touched in years. Her official file was, as he'd noted, strangely thin. Her educational background in library science and micro-electronics repair checked out, the records clean and verifiable. But her life before the age of 25 was a digital void. There were no school records, no medical history, no social security activity, no digital footprint whatsoever. It was as if she hadn't existed. For the modern world, a person without a data trail was more than an anomaly, they were a ghost. He kept digging, using his highest clearance levels to peel back layers of bureaucratic obfuscation, and then he found it. It wasn't in her file, but in a cross-referencing archive, a single, almost invisible digital marker linking her contractor ID to a classified project file. The file itself was locked down with a level of encryption he had only seen a handful of times, reserved for the nation's most sensitive secrets. But its project name was visible, a single, chilling word. Chimera. Blackwood muttered the name to himself, the syllables feeling alien on his tongue. Project Chimera. Never heard of it. He tried to access the file. The moment he entered his command override, his screen flashed a brilliant, angry red. A high-level security warning filled the display, informing him that his access was denied and that his attempt had been logged and flagged by a security protocol he didn't recognize. The file was not just classified, it was redacted at a level that suggested its very existence was a secret. A cold knot formed in Blackwood's stomach. This was far beyond a simple Black Ops program. This was something that had been deliberately and systematically erased. He turned away from the screen and picked up a secure satellite phone, punching in a number he hadn't dialed in over a decade. After a series of clicks and electronic handshakes, a voice answered, rough with sleep. "Mark, it's John Blackwood," he said, his voice low. "I need a favor, a big one." There was a groan on the other end. "John? It's 3 in the morning here. This had better be good. I need to know about a project codenamed Chimera," Blackwood said, cutting to the chase. "It's an old one, I think, from the late 1990s, maybe early 2000s. The silence on the other end of the line was sudden and absolute. When his contact, a high-ranking official at the Pentagon, finally spoke, his voice was stripped of all its earlier grogginess. It was sharp, alert, and laced with something that sounded like fear. "John, where did you hear that name?" "It concerns a civilian on my base," Blackwood replied, evading the question. "I need to know what it was." Listen to me. Mark's voice was now a harsh whisper. You don't ask about Chimera. You forget you ever heard the name. Officially, it never existed. The file is a ghost. The program is a ghost. He paused, and Blackwood could hear the faint sound of him breathing. And if you have someone on your base who is connected to it, then you don't have a civilian contractor, John. You have a ghost. Be careful. Be very, very careful. The line went dead. Blackwood slowly lowered the phone, the dial tone buzzing in the silent office. The mystery of Clara Vance had just deepened exponentially. She was no longer just a woman with a remarkable memory. She was the living remnant of a top, secret program so sensitive that its name was a danger in itself. A profound sense of dread settled over him. He was dealing with something far outside normal protocols, a secret that powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. And he was about to send her, and the team trusting her, into the heart of enemy territory. The base's mess hall was nearly empty during the off hours, a cavernous space filled with the low hum of refrigerators and the smell of bleach. Clara sat at a small table in the corner, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, the steam rising to mist her glasses. She was trying to find a moment of quiet, to still the frantic energy that had been thrumming through her since she'd walked to the map table. Being seen, truly seen, was a terrifying and profoundly lonely experience. Miss Vance. The voice was quiet, respectful. She looked up, startled, to see Hawk standing there. He wasn't in his full combat gear anymore, just fatigues, but he still seemed to fill the space. It was the first time a member of the team had approached her without a request or a complaint, and his demeanor was something she was entirely unused to from the SEALs. It was deference. "Sir," she replied, her voice barely audible. He didn't take a seat, but stood by the table, his hands clasped behind his back. "My team, we owe you," he said, his gaze direct and serious. "That alleyway, Rook showed us the satellite pass. You saved lives today, and we haven't even left the wire." Clara looked down at her teacup, at the slight tremor in her hands. "I just pointed out what I saw." "No," Hawk said, his voice firm. "You saw what a dozen analysts and $100 million satellite missed. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen things, but I've never seen anything like you." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "The way you understand the terrain, the way you drew it, it's like you've walked it yourself." Her hand trembled violently, rattling the ceramic cup against the saucer with a sharp clatter. She quickly steadied it with her other hand, her knuckles white. The memory hit her like a physical blow, a flash of dust and sun and fear, the feeling of worn leather boots on uneven ground in a place she was never supposed to have been. Hawk's words were more prescient than he could ever know, a stray shot that had struck the hidden, wounded heart of her past. "It's just patterns, sir," she managed to say, her voice tight. "Everything is a pattern. Buildings, streets, patrol routes. I just see the patterns." Hawk held her gaze for a long moment, sensing he had touched a nerve, though he didn't know how or why. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Maybe," he conceded. "But you see the patterns that matter." He took a step back, his posture shifting back to that of a soldier. "The team is ready. We're trusting your map." He paused, and his next words landed with the weight of a solemn vow. "We're trusting you." He turned and walked away, leaving Clara alone in the echoing silence of the mess hall. His words, a simple statement of trust, were the most significant thing anyone had said to her in years. It was a profound burden, and to her own surprise, a profound relief. For the first time, her gift wasn't a secret to be hidden, but a tool to be used, a responsibility to be shouldered. She was no longer invisible, and as she looked at her own reflection in the dark surface of her tea, she realized, with a jolt of fear and a flicker of something else, something like strength, that she might never be invisible again. The night was a starless, ink-black void. A cold wind swept down from the jagged peaks, whispering through the desolate, rocky terrain outside the target city. It was a dead landscape, all gravel and shadow, and the only sounds were the mournful sigh of the wind and the soft, rhythmic crunch of 8 pairs of boots moving in perfect unison. The men of SEAL Team 3 moved like ghosts through the darkness, their forms barely distinguishable from the rocks around them. The tension was a living thing, a 9th member of the team, wrapping itself around each man's chest. They were operating on pure faith, their lives staked on the hand, drawn map clutched in Thorne's gloved hand, a map drawn by a woman who fixed their scopes. They reached the first landmark an hour into the infiltration, the Al-Rashid Aqueduct, a massive, crumbling relic of a bygone era, loomed out of the darkness exactly where Clara had drawn it. Its silhouette against the slightly less black sky was a perfect match for the confident line she had sketched. Rook, on point, knelt behind a rock outcropping and spoke into his throat mic, his voice a barely audible whisper that carried across their encrypted comms. Comms check. At the aqueduct. Everything is as briefed. Solid copy. Thorne, positioned in the center of the formation, felt a muscle in his jaw twitch. He brought the map closer to his face, the faint red light from his helmet lamp illuminating the intricate drawing. It was perfect, too perfect. Stay sharp, he whispered back, his own voice tight, strained. Don't get complacent. It was a warning to his team, but also to himself. He couldn't afford to believe. Not yet. To believe would be to admit how catastrophically wrong he had been. They moved on, following the path she had laid out, a path that wound away from the most direct route and into a series of deep, natural trenches. They approached the series of retaining walls she had marked as essential cover. According to her drawing, the ridge above them was an exposed kill zone. As they slid into position behind the cold, damp concrete of the first wall, the low rumble of an engine grew in the distance. Every man froze, melting into the shadows. A moment later, a pickup truck with a heavy machine gun bolted to its bed, roared past on the ridge above them. Its headlights cut a swath through the darkness, passing just meters over their heads. The SEALs could smell its diesel fumes, could hear the rough laughter of the men inside. If they had been a minute earlier, or had taken the more obvious, faster route, they would have been caught in the open, silhouetted and helpless. A long, tense silence followed as the sound of the engine faded into the night. Then Hawk's voice, a slow, controlled exhalation of pure disbelief, crackled over the comms. Jesus, he breathed. She even timed the patrol route. In the darkness, the men exchanged unseen looks. Their faith in the map, and in the quiet woman who had drawn it, was no longer a fragile, tentative thing. It was solidifying into something hard and absolute, like concrete setting in the cold night air. Thorne didn't speak. He simply stared at the ridge where the truck had been, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. His resistance, his proud, stubborn certainty, was cracking under the undeniable weight of the evidence. He was alive because of her. They were all alive because of her. And the mission had barely begun. While the SEALs moved like shadows through the desolate landscape, Clara Vance sat in the cold, humming heart of the operation. The Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, was a world away from the grit and danger of the field. It was a dark, refrigerated room, filled with the glow of dozens of monitors displaying streams of data, drone feeds, and biometric readouts. Here, war was an abstraction, a series of icons moving across a screen. But for Clara, it was anything but. Commander Blackwood had given her a headset and a seat at the main console, directly beside him. She was no longer a maintenance tech, relegated to a corner stool. She was a mission controller, a vital cog in the machine. On the main screen before her was a digital overlay of her own hand-drawn map, the team's GPS trackers blinking like tiny green heartbeats as they moved across her lines. She was watching them through the grainy, night vision feeds from their helmet cams, her eyes darting from one screen to another, absorbing everything. She was not just watching, she was anticipating, her mind racing ahead of the team, walking the path with them. Blackwood observed her, his expression unreadable. The transformation was staggering. The quiet, almost mousy woman from the briefing room was gone. In her place was a figure of intense, focused energy. Her posture was alert, her back straight, her entire being concentrated on the flickering screens. She was completely absorbed, a part of the data stream. The team's green icons approached the small circle she had drawn on the map. They're approaching the dried-up well, the first fallback zone, she said, her voice low and clear, speaking to Blackwood, but her eyes never leaving the monitors. Tell them to be aware of loose shale on the western approach. It's a noisy descent. Blackwood stared at her for a half-second, his brow furrowed in bafflement. How could she possibly know that? He keyed his mic. Alpha Team, be advised, potential for loose shale on your approach to the well. Watch your footing. A moment later, Hawk's voice came back, calm and professional, but with an undercurrent of sheer astonishment. Copy that, TOC. Good call. That's a steep, shaly slope. We almost walked right into it. We'll find another way down. Blackwood turned his head slowly and looked at Clara. His expression was a mixture of profound amazement and a deep, growing concern. How could you know about loose rocks, Miss Vance? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's eyes finally left the screen, but they didn't focus on him. They were looking inward, accessing the vast, ordered library of her mind. I remember the geological survey from the initial intel packet, she said, her voice distant. Matter, of fact. The shale composition in that region is notoriously unstable. It was in a footnote on page 247 of the report. She then turned her attention back to the monitors, her brief explanation delivered as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, a slow chill creeping up his spine despite the room's cold temperature. A footnote. On page 247, he was no longer dealing with a woman who had a good memory. He was witnessing something else entirely. This wasn't just recall, it was synthesis, an intuitive, instantaneous cross-referencing of thousands of disparate data points into actionable, life-saving intelligence. He was watching a strategic genius at work, and the realization was both thrilling and terrifying. The ghost of Project Chimera was beginning to reveal the true, awesome extent of her power. Blackwood found himself back in his office an hour later, the secure satellite phone feeling heavy and cold in his hand. The team was bedded down in a secure position, waiting for the final approach, and he had left the TOC in the capable hands of his second-in-command. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He dialed the number again. Mark answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and paranoid. "John, I told you to drop this." "I can't, Mark," Blackwood said, his own voice low and urgent. "She's in the field. Not her, but a team. She's guiding them. From here, and she's never wrong. She's seeing things that aren't on any map, remembering details from reports no one even read. I need to know what she is." There was a long, heavy sigh on the other end of the line, the sound of a man being forced to unearth a corpse he had buried long ago. "Okay, John." Mark's voice was a hushed, hurried whisper, as if he feared the words themselves were monitored. "You did not hear this from me. If this ever comes back, I will deny everything." Project Chimera wasn't a weapons program, it was a human asset program, a black project run out of a DARPA sub-office in the late 1990s. He paused, and Blackwood waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. "They took a handful of kids," Mark continued, his voice strained. "Orphans, wards of the state, kids who had fallen through the cracks. But they weren't just any kids. They were children who showed signs of extreme, structured eidetic memory, savant-level recall. They didn't just have photographic memories, they had architectural ones. They could see how systems fit together." Blackwood's mind flashed to Clara's own words. "Asterisk. It's eidetic. And structural. I remember. Layouts. Patterns. Schematics. Asterisk." "They trained them," Mark went on, his voice barely audible. "Not as soldiers. Never as soldiers. They trained them as living reconnaissance databases. They'd sit these kids in dark rooms for years and just show them things. Thousands of hours of satellite footage, topographical maps, SIGINT reports, architectural blueprints, geological surveys. And the kids, they just absorbed it. All of it. They synthesized it. They became walking, talking, strategic analysts who could hold entire cities in their heads. They could see things no computer could because they could reference everything instantly and intuitively. They saw the patterns." Again, Clara's words echoed in his mind. "Asterisk. It's just patterns, sir. Everything is a pattern. Asterisk." "Then," Mark said, his voice dropping even lower, "they would send them on site. Not for combat, but for ground truth. Under deep cover, a geological expedition, a cultural survey, a student backpacking trip. Their job was to walk the ground, to see the things the satellites missed, to feel the rhythm of a place, to smell it, to hear it, to map the unseen, the unmapped, the storm drains, the smugglers' routes, the places people hide." A cold dread washed over Blackwood as the pieces clicked into place. "So, Clara," he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "The program was officially shut down, scrubbed from every record, after a mission went bad," Mark said, his voice grim. "One of the assets, a young man, was captured during a survey in the Balkans. They never got him back. The oversight committee panicked. They realized what they had created, these unbelievable assets with no way to defend themselves, so they buried it. They scrubbed the program from the records to protect the others, gave them new identities, new histories, and buried them in low-level, unremarkable jobs where they would never be noticed. A librarian, a microelectronics repair technician." Blackwood sank into his chair, the phone feeling slick with sweat in his palm. The maintenance manuals, the quiet corner, the invisibility. It was all a cover, a way for her to stay close to the world she understood, The world of schematics and systems, while remaining hidden in plain sight. Mark's voice came over the line one last time, heavy with a final, devastating revelation. Your maintenance tech isn't just a maintenance tech, John. She's a ghost of the most advanced intelligence program this country ever ran. And you need to understand something. She didn't just see the map, Commander. For a target this sensitive, there's a good chance she helped design the original recon for it. There's a good chance she's been there before. The team was in position. From the flat, gravel-strewn rooftop, they had a clear view of the target building, a squat, concrete block of apartments less than 200 meters away. The asset was inside, confirmed by a brief electronic handshake their gear had picked up. All that remained was the final approach, a dangerous crossing of an open courtyard that separated their position from their objective. Clara's map, the sacred text they now lived by, detailed a longer, more circuitous route. It was an ugly, complex path that involved climbing to a higher rooftop, shimmying across a series of rusted overhead pipes, and dropping down onto the target building's fire escape. It was slow, awkward, and exposed them in unconventional ways, but it avoided the courtyard entirely. Thorne lay flat on his stomach, peering through his rifle's high, powered scope. He scanned the courtyard, the alleyways, the windows of the surrounding buildings. His pride, though battered and bruised, was not yet broken. It was a stubborn, malignant thing, and it whispered to him now, telling him that he was still the commander, the one with 15 years of operational experience. He saw what he believed was a better way, a faster way. It was a covered alleyway running along the south side of the courtyard, a direct line to the target building's rear entrance. It wasn't marked as a viable route on Clara's map. In fact, she had drawn a faint, almost invisible X over its entrance, a detail he chose to interpret as uncertain rather than a definitive warning. His desire to prove he was still in command, to claw back a shred of the authority he had lost, got the better of him. He would make a command decision, a real one, not just follow the lines drawn by a ghost in the machine. "Talk, this is Alpha," he whispered into his comms, his voice tight with a forced confidence. "I have eyes on a better approach. A covered alley, south side. It'll cut our exposure time in half. We're taking it." In the sterile cold of the Tactical Operations Center, Clara Vance stood up so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "No," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the low hum of the room. She strode to stand directly behind Blackwood, her eyes locked on the helmet, cam feed from Thorne's position, which showed the dark maw of the alley. "Commander, that alley is a fatal funnel. It's a kill box. It's not covered. It's overlooked by 5 different windows from 2 separate buildings. It's a trap." Blackwood didn't hesitate. He keyed his mic, his voice a whip crack of authority. "Alpha, abort. Abort that route." "That is a direct order, Lieutenant." "Acknowledge." But it was too late. Thorne, his pride and ambition blinding him to the danger, had already committed. He was convinced he was right, that he had spotted the tactical nuance the analyst had missed. "Negative, TOC," he replied, his voice strained with defiance. "I have the situation under control." He was already moving, signaling his team to follow him off the rooftop and down into the courtyard, heading for the alley. "We're proceeding." The moment the last man in the team, trailing by a few meters, cleared the entrance to the alley, the world exploded. High-powered floodlights, mounted in unseen positions, flashed on with a blinding, instantaneous glare, illuminating the narrow passage with the merciless brilliance of a surgical theater. For a split second, the SEALs were frozen, caught like insects in amber, their night vision goggles whiting out completely. Then the sound came, a deafening, concussive roar as gunfire erupted from the windows above them. It wasn't random firing, it was a coordinated, perfectly executed ambush. Bullets chewed into the concrete walls, sparking and whining, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. The air became a solid wall of noise and violence. "Contact! Contact!" Hawk screamed into the comms, the words almost lost in the cacophony. "We're pinned! Rook is hit!" Rook had gone down instantly, a cry of pain choked off as rounds stitched across his leg, sending him sprawling to the filthy ground. The team scrambled for the pathetic cover offered by a dumpster and a few piles of trash, returning fire blindly at the unseen windows. Thorne, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic, pressed himself against a wall, his mind refusing to process what was happening. "Where is it coming from?" he yelled, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I can't see them, I can't see them." The comms channel dissolved into a chaos of shouting, reports of ammunition counts, and the agonized groans of the wounded Rook. They were trapped, they were dead. Back in the TOC, Clara was ice cold. The timid maintenance tech, the woman who flinched at loud noises and hid in corners, was gone. In her place stood the Chimera asset, a being forged in data and trained for crisis. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask, her eyes scanning the multiple helmet, cam feeds with an impossible speed, processing the chaos into cold, hard data. She reached over the shoulder of a stunned communications officer and took the primary headset, pushing the transmit button herself. Her voice cut through the panic on the comms channel with the clean, sharp authority of a razor blade. "Alpha Team, this is Vance. Listen to me. Now." The shouting on the other end stopped. The SEALs, desperate, out of options, and dying, fell silent. They listened. "The fire is coming from the second and third story windows of the buildings on your left and right," she stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of pure information. "You are in a kill box. Do not try to go forward. Do not try to go back. You will not make it." In the alley, Hawk, dragging Rook behind the dumpster, looked at Thorne, whose face was slack with shock. The lieutenant was broken. Hawk made a decision. He keyed his mic. "We hear you, Vance. Talk to us." "Thorne," Clara's voice commanded, ignoring Hawk and speaking directly to the man who had led them into the trap. 50 meters to your 9 o'clock, there is a concrete drainage culvert. The opening is approximately 1 meter high and is hidden behind a pile of discarded construction debris and trash. It is not on any schematic, but it is there. It will take you into the city's old storm drain system. It is your only way out." The SEALs, their survival now hanging on the words of a woman they had mocked just hours before, turned their heads as one, searching the debris, choked wall for the opening she described. Their world had shrunk to a single desperate task. Trust the voice in the ether. Trust the ghost. "I see it." Hawk's voice was a raw shout of desperate hope. "I see the culvert." It was exactly where she'd said it would be, a dark, square opening almost completely obscured by a mound of rotting garbage and broken concrete. It was their rabbit hole, their only escape from the hellstorm. "Covering fire!" Hawk roared, and the remaining members of the team unleashed a furious, concentrated volley of fire at the windows above, providing a few precious seconds of suppression. Hawk and another SEAL grabbed the injured Rook by his body armor, dragging him across the exposed ground as bullets kicked up dust around their feet. Thorne, jolted from his stupor by the sheer force of Clara's command, laid down a desperate, wild spray of fire, his face a mess of tears and cordite. One by one, they scrambled and dove through the opening, plunging from the blinding light and deafening noise of the kill box into a sudden, absolute darkness and a silence broken only by their own ragged, desperate panting. They had made it. They were in the drain. Thorne collapsed against the slimy wall of the tunnel, his body shaking uncontrollably. "We're in," he gasped into his comms, the words choked with shame and relief. "We're in the drain." Back in the TOC, Clara's eyes were closed. She wasn't looking at the screens anymore. The helmet cams were useless in the pitch black of the tunnel. She was looking at the map inside her head, a map of a place she had never wanted to see again. "Good." Her voice came over their headsets, calm and steady, an anchor in the terrifying dark. "Follow the main tunnel west for approximately 200 meters. The floor is uneven, and there is a steady flow of water on the left side. Stay to the right. You will come to a junction with a rusted iron ladder set into the north wall. Take it." The team moved, stumbling through the darkness, the stench of sewage and decay filling their nostrils. They followed her instructions without question, their faith in her now absolute, total, and terrifying. They reached the junction, and Hawk's hand, sweeping the wall, found the cold, rough texture of the rusted ladder. "We're at the ladder," Hawk reported, his voice filled with a quiet, profound awe. "How do you know this, Vance? How is this possible? This isn't on any map." In the TOC, Blackwood watched Clara. Her eyes were still closed, her face pale. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but her voice, when she spoke, was devoid of any weakness. It was laced with a deep, ancient weariness, the sound of a wound being reopened after years of trying to heal. There was a long pause on the comms, a silence that stretched for an eternity. Then, Clara's voice came back to them, a ghost's whisper from a past they could not comprehend. "Because I mapped this drain system 6 years ago," she said, her voice barely audible, yet every word landed like a physical blow. "On foot. My name was different then." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound of a lock breaking open. "The ladder will lead you to the basement of the bakery adjacent to the target building. The west wall is brick, but it's old. You can breach it silently. Now move." Hours later, the briefing room was a different world. The frantic energy of the operation had been replaced by a heavy, somber quiet. The air was stale with the scent of cold sweat, grime, and exhaustion. The men of Alpha Team were present, alive, but visibly marked by the ordeal. They were grimy, their faces etched with fatigue, but they were whole. Rook sat slightly apart, his leg bandaged and propped up on a chair, his face pale but his eyes clear. The asset, a thin man with haunted eyes, had been secured and was already on a transport out of the country. The mission was, by the slimmest of margins, a success. Commander Blackwood stood at the head of the table, his face carved from granite. At his side, no longer in the corner, no longer a shadow, stood Clara. She was wearing her simple maintenance fatigues, but she stood with a stillness that was not timid, but centered. She was no longer an object in the room, she was a presence. Blackwood began the debrief, his voice cold, formal, and utterly devoid of warmth. The asset is secure, mission successful. No friendly casualties, though not for a lack of trying. His gaze, hard as steel, fell upon Lieutenant Thorne. Lieutenant, you directly disobeyed a clear and direct order from a superior officer. You compromised the entire operation, and your actions were reckless, arrogant, and endangered every man on your team. Thorne stood up. He did not look like a SEAL team leader. The supreme confidence, the swagger, the arrogance, it had all been stripped from him, burned away in the fire of the killbox. He was pale, his eyes were red, rimmed, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and seen his own failure reflected back. "Sir," he began, his voice hoarse, broken, "there is no excuse. There is nothing I can say to justify my actions." He swallowed hard, his gaze sweeping over his men before landing, finally, on Clara. His eyes, once filled with contempt and dismissal, now held a raw, painful, and profound humility she never thought she would witness. "I was wrong. Miss Vance," he faltered, the name catching in his throat. "She was right. About everything. She saved us. All of us. He couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come." He shook his head, a single, sharp gesture of self, disgust, and sat back down, a broken man. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken agreement. Then Hawke spoke up, his voice a low, steady rumble that filled the room. "Sir, what Miss Vance did down there, it wasn't just a map, it wasn't just intelligence." He looked at Clara, his expression one of deep, unwavering respect. She saw the whole battlefield. She was our eyes, our guide. When we were blind and trapped, she was our guardian angel. There is not a man in this room who wouldn't follow her into hell itself after tonight. One by one, the other members of the team nodded, their faces grim but their agreement absolute. Rook, from his chair, added his own quiet testament. "She saved my life, sir. Period." The role reversal was complete, and it was stunning in its finality. Thorne, the proud warrior, was humbled. Clara, the invisible technician, was now the object of the team's complete and utter admiration. She was no longer an outsider, a contractor, a grease monkey. She had become something more, something essential. In the crucible of the killbox, she had been forged into one of them, in a way that transcended rank, role, or uniform. She had become their anchor, their truth, and they knew it. Later, in the quiet solitude of his office, Commander Blackwood closed the door, the soft click of the latch sealing them off from the rest of the base. He turned to Clara, his expression no longer just analytical or curious, but filled with a deep, paternal respect. The hand-drawn map, now smudged and creased, lay on his desk like a historical artifact. "Project Chimera," he said, his voice soft. "I know what you are, Clara. I know what they did." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I'm sorry for what was done to you, forcing you to live in the shadows, to hide what you are." Clara looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in front of her. For years, that name had been a terror, a secret to be buried at all costs. Hearing it spoken aloud felt like a violation, but also, strangely, like a release. "It was meant to protect us, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "After what happened to the others, hiding was safe, being invisible was safe." "You're not invisible anymore," Blackwood stated, his tone gentle but firm. "And you're not safe, not anymore. Now that you've shown what you can do, even on this small scale, the recording of your guidance from the TOC is already a classified legend in the making. People will come looking, the kind of people who shut down Chimera in the first place." He leaned against his desk, his expression turning deadly serious. "They'll see you as a loose end, a threat. They'll either want to use you for their own ends, or they'll want to bury you for good." Clara felt a familiar cold dread seep into her bones. He was right. Her greatest fear, the one she had lived with for years, was coming true. She was exposed. "But you have another option," Blackwood continued, his voice pulling her back from the edge of panic. Your file is being rewritten as we speak. No more library science, no more micro-electronics repair. I'm creating a new position, effective immediately. Strategic analysis and mission oversight. It's your role. Your gift, officially sanctioned. He pushed a document across the desk toward her. You'll work here, with me, on this base. You'll have a rank, a security detail, and access to all the intel you can memorize. You won't be a ghost anymore, Clara. You'll be at the center of operations. He let the words sink in, giving her a moment to process the life-altering choice he was laying before her. It's your choice, he finished, his voice softening again. You can take this, step into the light, and embrace who you are, with all the risks and responsibilities that come with it. Or, I can make you disappear again, give you a new name, a new life, and you can go back to hiding in the shadows that have kept you safe, but have also kept you alone. Clara stared at the document, at the official letterhead, at the new title printed beside her name. For years, she had dreamed of this, of being able to use her abilities without fear, of being part of something, of belonging. But the shadows had been her sanctuary. Invisibility had been her armor. To give that up was to make herself a target. She thought of the fear in Thorn's eyes, the respect in Hawke's, the life she had saved. She thought of the girl who had been trained to see the world as a blueprint, and the woman who had forced herself to see only the schematics of a targeting pod. The choice was between a safe life that was a lie and a dangerous life that was the truth. She looked up from the paper and met Blackwood's gaze. The tear that had traced its way down her cheek in the TOC was gone. Her eyes were clear, steady, and for the first time since he had met her, they held no fear. When do I start? She asked. 1 week later, the briefing room was set up for a new mission. A new team of SEALs, fresh from the States, sat around the main table, their energy a low hum of anticipation. They were younger than Thorn's team, their faces still holding a sheen of eagerness that had not yet been ground down by the realities of war. Hawke and Rook were there as well, standing against the back wall, not as part of the briefing team, but as observers, their presence a silent endorsement of what was to come. The seat at the head of the table, the one in front of the main screen where the commander always sat, was empty. The door slid open and Clara Vance walked in. The transformation was absolute. She was wearing a crisp new uniform, a specialist's rank clearly visible on her collar. She carried a tablet in one hand, but it was her posture, her presence, that commanded the room. The timid, hunched, shouldered woman from the corner was gone forever. This woman was confident, poised, her movements economical and filled with purpose. Her eyes, once perpetually downcast, now swept across the room, meeting the gaze of each SEAL in turn. She walked to the head of the table and took her place, the seat of command. The young SEALs watched her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and confusion. They had been told only that a new strategic analyst would be handling their briefing. They saw a woman who looked more like a librarian than an operator. Clara looked at the faces of the new team, seeing their uncertainty, their unspoken questions. She understood. She had a long way to go to earn their trust, but she was no longer afraid of the journey. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of deep water, of immense, underlying power. It filled the room with an undeniable authority that had every man sitting up a little straighter. "Your target is a chemical weapons cache hidden in the Sertau region. The intelligence you have been given is wrong." She tapped the screen of her tablet, and a complex, multi-layered map appeared on the main screen behind her. It was a tapestry of satellite imagery, geological surveys, and signal intelligence intercepts, but Clara didn't look at the screen. She looked directly at the men, her memory already painting a picture for them that was far more detailed, far more real, than any digital display could ever be. The terrain is unstable, prone to flash floods this time of year, and their security is not what you think. They are not using a conventional perimeter. Her eyes moved from man to man, locking them in place. "Let me show you what's really there." In the back of the room, Hawke allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The ghost was a ghost no longer. She had found her place. The quiet girl from the corner had finally taken her seat at the head of the table, and the world would be a safer place for it.